The Tale of Ivory and the Envious Queen. Once, in a distant kingdom where the winters were cold and the forests stretched endlessly, a queen sat by her window embroidering. The frame she worked upon was carved from deep black ebony, and as she stitched, delicate snowflakes danced outside. As she concentrated, the needle pricked her finger, and 3 drops of crimson blood fell upon the white snow. Gazing at the contrast of colors, she whispered, "Oh, how I wish for a child with skin as fair as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as dark as ebony." Not long after, the queen's wish was granted, and she gave birth to a daughter, a child of astonishing beauty. The baby was named Ivory, for her skin was as pale as the snowfall outside. However, happiness was short-lived, for soon after giving birth, the queen fell gravely ill and passed away. The king, burdened by sorrow, eventually remarried. His new wife was breathtakingly beautiful, but filled with pride and vanity. She possessed a mystical mirror, one that never lied. Each day, she would stand before it and ask, "Mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would answer, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." Satisfied with its words, she would go about her day, basking in her own reflection. But as the years passed, Ivory grew into a young girl of extraordinary beauty, her charm far surpassing that of her stepmother. One fateful morning, when the queen stood before her enchanted mirror, she posed her usual question. This time, the mirror responded, "You are fair, O queen. It's true, but Ivory is fairer than you." The queen's face twisted with rage. Her jealousy burned so fiercely that it consumed her thoughts. Day after day, envy gnawed at her heart, and soon she could think of nothing but removing Ivory from existence. Summoning a huntsman, she ordered, "Take the girl deep into the forest. I want her gone from my sight forever. Bring me her heart as proof of your loyalty." The huntsman, though bound to his duty, hesitated. As he led Ivory into the shadowy woods, he drew his blade, preparing to carry out the dreadful command. But before he could strike, the girl fell to her knees, tears shimmering in her wide eyes. "Please, kind huntsman," she pleaded, "spare my life, and I shall vanish into the forest, never to return." The man's heart wavered. How could he harm such an innocent soul? Lowering his weapon, he whispered, "Run, child, run far and never look back." With that, Ivory turned and fled into the darkened woods, unaware of the dangers that lurked within. The hunt for her was far from over. Ivory and the 7 guardians. The huntsman, unable to take Ivory's life, sighed with relief as he let her go. "Run, child, and may fortune be kind to you," he whispered, watching as she disappeared into the dense forest. He knew the wild creatures roaming those woods would likely find her, yet he could not bring himself to commit such a terrible act. Just then, a young wild boar rushed past him. Without hesitation, he caught and killed it, taking its heart as proof of his supposed deed. He returned to the queen with his grim offering, and without question, the wicked woman had the heart cooked and ate it, believing she had rid herself of Ivory forever. Meanwhile, deep within the forest, the frightened girl ran with all her might. Every rustling leaf and shadow among the trees filled her with dread. The sharp stones cut her feet, the thorny branches scratched her arms, yet she dared not stop. Wild animals moved around her, their glowing eyes watching from the darkness, but none harmed her. At last, as twilight settled over the land, Ivory came upon a small cottage nestled beneath the towering trees. Exhausted, she stepped inside. The house was unlike anything she had ever seen, tiny, yet perfectly arranged. A small table stood in the center, covered with a clean white cloth, set with 7 delicate plates, 7 tiny cups, and 7 silver utensils. Against the far wall, 7 little beds lay in neat rows, their blankets pristine and inviting. Hunger gnawed at her belly, so she took a bite from each plate, sipped a drop of wine from each cup, careful not to finish any single portion. Then, overwhelmed with fatigue, she tried the beds, but they were either too hard, too soft, too long, or too short. Finally, the 7th bed fit just right. Whispering a silent prayer of thanks, she drifted into a deep sleep. That night, as the forest grew quiet, the owners of the cottage returned home. 7 dwarfs, miners of the great mountains, trudged through the door, their lamps flickering in the darkness. Upon entering, they noticed immediately that something was amiss. "Who has been sitting in my chair?" asked the first. "Who has taken a bite from my bread?" questioned the second. "Who has eaten from my plate?" inquired the third. "Who has tasted my porridge?" muttered the fourth. "Who has used my fork?" wondered the fifth. "Who has cut with my knife?" asked the sixth. "Who has sipped from my cup?" exclaimed the seventh. Their eyes darted around, confusion filling the air. Then the first dwarf peered at his bed and gasped. "Someone has been sleeping here," he cried. One by one, they gathered around the smallest bed and lifted their lanterns, casting a warm glow over the sleeping girl. They stared in wonder. "Oh, what a beautiful child," they murmured in astonishment. They marveled at her pale skin, her dark flowing hair, and her delicate features. Not wanting to disturb her rest, they let her sleep. The smallest dwarf, having no bed of his own, took turns lying beside each of his companions for an hour at a time throughout the night. When morning arrived, Ivory stirred. As her eyes fluttered open, she gasped at the sight of the small figures surrounding her. Fear flashed across her face, but the dwarfs smiled kindly, their eyes twinkling with warmth. "Do not be afraid," said the eldest. "What is your name?" "I am Ivory," she answered softly. "And how did you come to be in our home?" asked another. With a trembling voice, she told them everything: the cruel queen, the huntsman's mercy, her long and desperate escape through the forest. As she spoke, the dwarfs listened intently, their expressions growing troubled. At last, one of them spoke. "You may stay with us, dear child, but beware, for if the queen learns you are alive, she will surely seek to destroy you." Ivory nodded solemnly. She had found refuge for now, but danger still loomed beyond the trees. Ivory and the wicked disguise. The dwarfs, filled with kindness, spoke to Ivory. "If you stay with us, you must help keep our home in order. Cook, clean, wash, sew, and make our beds. In return, you will never go without, and we shall protect you." With gratitude in her heart, Ivory agreed. "With all my heart, I shall stay and care for your home." From that day on, she tended to their cottage, ensuring everything was neat and welcoming. Each morning, the 7 dwarfs journeyed into the mountains to mine for gold, and each evening they returned to a warm meal prepared by the young girl. Before leaving each day, they warned her sternly, "Beware of your stepmother. If she discovers you are alive, she will not rest until she sees you gone. Do not open the door to anyone." Ivory nodded, understanding the danger that loomed over her. The queen's wrath. Far away, in the grand palace, the queen stood before her enchanted mirror, believing at last she was the most beautiful in the land. With confidence she asked, "Mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" But this time, the mirror's voice rang out with a truth that shattered her illusion. "O queen, your beauty is rare, but Ivory, safe in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." The queen's face darkened with rage. The huntsman had deceived her. Ivory still lived. Jealousy clawed at her heart. She could not stand the thought of another surpassing her in beauty. Night and day she plotted, devising a way to rid herself of Ivory once and for all. At last, she conceived a sinister plan. She disguised herself as an old peddler woman, painting her face and dressing in tattered garments. No one would recognize the queen beneath the hunched posture and wrinkled hands. Then, carrying a basket of wares, she set off, traversing 7 mountains until she reached the dwarf's cottage, the Deadly Lace. Knocking upon the door, she called out in a feeble, trembling voice, "Fine wares for sale, beautiful laces, fine wares." Ivory, hearing the call, peeked out the window. She saw an old woman, her arms holding up shimmering laces in vibrant colors. "Good day, kind woman," she greeted. "What do you sell?" "Only the finest wares, dear child," the disguised queen crooned, lifting a delicate lace of shimmering silk. "See how beautiful it is? Would it not suit you perfectly?" Ivory hesitated, remembering the dwarf's warning. But the woman seemed harmless, her voice kind, her offer tempting. "Surely there is no danger in this," she thought, unbarring the door and stepping outside. Eagerly, she took the fine lace and admired its craftsmanship. "Oh, but let me help you, dear girl," the old woman said sweetly. "You must be laced properly, so you may look your best." Trusting her words, Ivory turned her back, allowing the woman to fasten the lace around her waist. But the moment the queen tightened the strings, her true intent was revealed. She pulled the lace cruelly, constricting Ivory's breath tighter and tighter until she could no longer breathe. Ivory gasped, her vision darkening, and collapsed lifelessly to the ground. The queen, victorious, smirked down at her. "Now you will trouble me no more." Satisfied, she turned and hurried away, believing her wicked deed was done. The queen's final deception. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the 7 dwarfs returned home, only to be met with a terrifying sight. Ivory lay motionless on the floor, her face pale, her body lifeless. Rushing to her side, they examined her closely and saw the cruelly tightened lace around her waist. With swift hands, they cut through the fabric, loosening the grip that had nearly stolen her life. Ivory gasped, drawing in a desperate breath. Her eyes fluttered open, and color slowly returned to her cheeks. The dwarfs, relieved yet deeply troubled, listened as she recounted what had happened. "That was no peddler woman," one of them declared. "It was your stepmother in disguise. She will stop at nothing to harm you." They warned her again. "No matter what, do not open the door to anyone." The poisoned comb. Meanwhile, the wicked queen, believing herself victorious, returned to her palace and once again consulted her mirror. Mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of them all? The mirror, bound to truth, spoke once more. "O queen, your beauty is rare, but Ivory, living in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." The queen's blood ran cold. Ivory still lived. Fury twisted her heart. She paced through the halls of her chamber, consumed by rage. This time, she would not fail. Using dark magic, she crafted a poisoned comb, one so deadly that a single touch would bring instant doom. Disguising herself once again as a humble old woman, she set out across the 7 mountains, arriving at the dwarf's cottage. Knocking gently on the door, she called, "Fine wares for sale! Beautiful combs of the finest make." Ivory, remembering the dwarf's warning, peeked cautiously out the window. "Go away," she said. "I must not let anyone in." The queen, feigning innocence, held up a glistening comb. "Ah, but surely it does no harm to look," she said sweetly, turning the comb so that it sparkled in the sunlight. Ivory's eyes widened. It was the most beautiful comb she had ever seen. Hesitant, but unable to resist, she unlatched the door and made her purchase. "Let me help you," the disguised queen offered. Such lovely hair should be properly combed. The moment the comb touched Ivory's hair, the poison seeped into her skin. A chilling numbness spread through her body, and she collapsed to the ground, lifeless once more. With a cruel smirk, the queen whispered, "Now, beauty, your time is truly at an end." Then she vanished into the forest, convinced that this time Ivory could not escape her fate. A second rescue. By good fortune, the dwarfs returned home before nightfall and found Ivory unconscious once again. Their hearts sank, but their keen eyes spotted the poisoned comb still tangled in her locks. With haste, they pulled it free, and almost immediately, she gasped awake. Tears filled her eyes as she told them of the old woman and the comb. "It was her again," one of the dwarfs growled. "The queen will not stop until she succeeds. You must promise us, Ivory. No matter how harmless someone appears, you must never, ever let anyone inside." Ivory swore to them that she would be careful, but danger still lurked on the horizon. The deadly apple. Back at the castle, the queen, confident in her victory, once more turned to her mirror. Mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of them all? To her horror, the mirror repeated its fateful words. "O queen, your beauty is rare, but Ivory, living in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." The queen shook with rage. She clenched her fists so tightly that her nails bit into her skin. "She lives still? Then so be it. If I must risk everything to destroy her, I shall." Retreating into a secret chamber, hidden deep within the castle, she crafted her most devious weapon yet, a poisoned apple, flawless in its deception. The fruit gleamed red like the richest rose, its white flesh soft and tempting. But only one half of it was tainted, laced with a poison so deadly that even a single bite would bring instant death. Disguising herself once more, this time as a simple peasant woman, she set off once again, determined to cross the 7 mountains and put an end to Ivory once and for all. Arriving at the little house, she knocked at the door. Ivory, remembering the dwarf's warnings, did not open it. She only called out from the window, "Go away! I am forbidden to let anyone inside." The queen, feigning innocence, sighed. "Ah, my dear, I understand. The world is dangerous indeed. But I have such beautiful apples, and it would be a shame to let them go to waste." Ivory, still wary, refused. "I dare not take anything." The queen smiled slyly. "Ah, I see. You fear poison. Very wise. Look here, I shall cut the apple in two. You take one half, and I shall eat the other. Surely, if I eat mine, you know it must be safe." She took a bite from the harmless white side and chewed happily, making a show of swallowing. Seeing this, Ivory hesitated. The fruit was so lovely, so inviting, and the woman had eaten hers without harm. Her longing for the beautiful apple won over her caution. She reached out, took the red half, and bit into it. The effect was immediate. Her body seized, her vision darkened, and she collapsed to the ground. The queen's lips curled into a triumphant smile. "As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony," she murmured. "This time, no one will wake you." She left without looking back, confident that she had finally claimed her victory. The dwarfs' despair. That evening, when the dwarfs returned, they found Ivory lying cold upon the ground. No breath escaped her lips, no sign of life remained. Frantically, they searched for a cause. They loosened her laces, checked her hair, washed her in water and wine. But nothing helped. She was gone. Grief overwhelmed them. For 3 days, they kept vigil beside her, refusing to bury her. For even in death, her cheeks remained fair and her beauty untouched. Yet, deep in their hearts, they could not accept that this was truly the end. Ivory's awakening and the queen's fate. The 7 dwarfs, heartbroken by Ivory's untimely death, could not bear to bury her in the cold earth. "She looks as though she is only sleeping," they whispered. To honor her, they built a coffin of pure glass, so her beauty could be seen from all sides. Upon it, they inscribed in golden letters her name and the truth of her royal birth. They carried the coffin to a sacred spot atop the mountain, where the sunlight bathed her in a gentle glow. One dwarf always stood guard, keeping watch over her. Even the creatures of the forest came to mourn her. An owl perched upon a branch, a raven circled above, and at last, a dove nestled beside her. Days turned to weeks, and still Ivory remained unchanged, her skin as white as the snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as dark as ebony. The prince's arrival. One day, a prince from a distant kingdom rode through the dense woods. As he approached the dwarf's home, his eyes fell upon the glass coffin atop the mountain. His heart was struck with awe. He had never seen such beauty, even in sleep. Stepping closer, he read the golden inscription and realized this was the daughter of a king. Turning to the dwarfs, he pleaded, "Please let me take her with me. I will give you anything you ask in return." The dwarfs shook their heads. "We cannot part with her, not for all the gold in the world." The prince, desperate, begged, "I cannot live without looking upon her face. If you let me take her, I will cherish her always and honor you as my own brothers." Seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the dwarfs took pity on him. At last, they agreed and entrusted him with Ivory's coffin. As his servants carried the glass case through the forest, they stumbled over a twisted root. The sudden jolt shook the coffin, and from Ivory's lips slipped the small piece of poisoned apple lodged in her throat. Within moments, she gasped for air. Her eyes fluttered open, and she sat up, bewildered. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. The prince, overwhelmed with joy, knelt before her. "You are safe now. I have found you, and I wish for nothing more than for you to come with me. Will you be my bride?" With kindness in her heart and hope in her eyes, Ivory agreed. Together, they traveled to his father's kingdom, where preparations began for a wedding unlike any the land had ever seen. The queen's final defeat. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the wicked queen stood before her enchanted mirror once more. Mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of them all? This time, the mirror gave her a chilling answer. "O queen, your beauty is rare, but the young bride is 1,000 times more fair." The queen's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled, her breath quickened. She knew the truth. Ivory was alive. She screamed in fury, cursing the very ground beneath her feet. At first, She resolved not to go to the wedding, but the fire of jealousy burned too fiercely within her. She had to see this bride with her own eyes. Dressing in her finest silks and jewels, she arrived at the palace, but when she stepped into the grand hall, she froze. There, before her, stood Ivory, radiant, alive, and more beautiful than ever. A terrible fear gripped the queen. She could not move, could not speak. She had been defeated, but the kingdom had prepared a cruel fate for her wickedness. A pair of red-hot iron shoes awaited her. As punishment for her evil deeds, she was forced to dance in them until she collapsed, never to rise again. Happily ever after, with the queen's reign of terror ended, Ivory and the prince were wed in a grand celebration filled with joy, music, and laughter. The dwarfs were honored as dear friends, and their kindness was never forgotten. From that day forward, Ivory ruled with wisdom, grace, and a heart full of love. She had faced cruelty, betrayal, and death itself, yet in the end, her kindness, courage, and pure heart had triumphed over darkness. And so, she lived happily ever after. If you loved this tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. What story should we tell next? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, keep believing in magic.